today, I might try a watercolor challenge with certain predetermined criteria and rolling dice to determine things randomly. So first, the paintbrush limitations. I've already decided I'm using a minimum of 4 brushes and a minimum of 1 from each of these separated categories: small, normal, medium large, and large. I'll start by rolling this D8. 8. That means I'm going to use a total of 8 brushes with a minimum of 1 from each category. Now I'm going to switch to a D6 to determine things down more specifically. I'll start by rolling for the small brush category. Using a D6 as a D3 means 1 and 2 is 1, 3 and 4 is 2, and 5 and 6 is 3. So now I'll roll. A 6. A 6 means I'll take all 3. These are just options. I'm not forced to use every brush, but it gives me what my limited options are. Now I'll go to the very large category and roll a D6 as a D3 again. A 2, that means I'll only be taking 1 of the very large brushes. Now to roll which one? 6 is 3, so the farthest over. This is the brush. That means I won't be using these 2 brushes. Now we have 2 more categories left and 4 brushes remaining. So I think I'll take 2 from each of these 2 categories. Counting the brushes, there are 9. So I'll use a D10 and just make 10 a reroll. So here I'm going to roll 5. Counting over from this side over, I get brush number 5. This little makeup brush from the dollar store. Now I'm going to reroll. 10 is a reroll. 4. Counting over, I get this nice little angle brush I got from a set a while ago. And now the last category, the medium large. Counting them out, there are 8. I'm going to use 2 of these. So, rolling a D8, that's 7. This is brush 7. And now, oh, that was a reroll, and 5. Oops, off screen, it was a reroll, and a 5. Here we are, this is number 5, which is a makeup mop brush. These ones will not be used for this particular painting. And here's a look at all the brushes we just got randomly, set up in a sort of decent order in order to display what my options are for this painting. Alright, now let's move on to the next thing. Now I'm going to roll if white gouache will be a part of this painting or not. I want it to be less likely. 1 to 5 is no gouache, and 6 to 8 is yes, I will be using gouache. So let's roll. 1. That means, sadly, no gouache. And now on to the main event, the watercolor tubes. These are all my best watercolor tubes I'm going to choose without looking. I've already decided I'm going to choose 5 colors altogether. So I close my eyes and choose randomly. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the colors are Daniel Smith, Cobalt Teal Blue, Cotman, Raw Umber, Daniel Smith, Mummy Bauxite, Winsor & Newton, Green Gold, Professional Series, and Turner Artist Watercolor, Ultramarine. In addition, I'll be checking if I'm going to be using the Stabilo All Black Water-Soluble Pencil in this artwork or not. Rolling a D6. 1 to 3 is no, 4 to 6 is yes. 6, that means yes. And now for the paper. I have 8 types here, counting from there all the way to the bottom. Top is 1, going down is number 8. Rolling a D8. I accidentally rolled it off camera, but it's an 8. So the paper type is the Strathmore 300 smooth Bristol paper. So after determining the paper, I cut different pieces up. Now I'm doing some tests. I begin by squeezing out small amounts of each watercolor paint onto this tearaway palette, although I can reuse it later. I like to save the old tearaway palette pages that still have the watercolor paint on it to reuse later, rather than throwing it away. I'm considering doing a video, which is a challenge, to make an entire painting just with leftover paint, or multiple paintings, but only with leftover paint. I keep the tubes nearby for later, so I can keep squeezing out a little more of the paint as I need it. I already have all these colors in various palettes, but it's spread out and mixed between, so I decided to take more fresh paint out just for this. Using this scrap of paper and only the brushes I'd already selected, I start doing different swatches and tests to see what the paint looks like on this exact type of paper. Each paper works differently, and colors look differently on different paper. I try to get a feel for how the paint works on this paper, as well as how it looks. I'm going to have to keep in mind that paint will look different wet and dry, so I also need to do this ahead of time to keep an eye on what it looks like dry. I'm going to do different color mixes as well. I begin by mixing the green gold and the cobalt teal blue. I'm putting the mixes sort of between the two in order to remember what the mixes were without having to label everything perfectly. And I begin looking at how the different colors mix in order to get an idea of what color range I can use in the final artwork. This is also good study in general, so I can get to know and understand the different paints I've invested in. Keep in mind that I've edited and sped up this footage, including cutting out parts where I'm rinsing the brush, but I do highly recommend you thoroughly rinse your brush out between colors so as not to accidentally contaminate colors and mix things you didn't intend. This is especially important when doing tests, but it's pretty much important all the time unless you don't mind things getting a bit muddy. You can also switch between brushes. I end up just using this pencil here because I hadn't brought down a fine liner and didn't want to go upstairs to get it, although normally when I do these sort of tests and take notes, I use a black fine liner or ink pen so that I don't have to worry about any sort of pencil smudging over time. I advise you keep these sort of tests. This is good for understanding the paint swatches, but also understanding how the paper works. As I go along, I'm not only studying what colors I'm mixing, but as I said, I'm studying how the paper works. This smooth bristle is extra smooth, which is very fun for the glidability and smoothness. It's normally an absolutely excellent, top-notch paper for inks and inking, but not necessarily great for everything else. It's too smooth, for example, to use with colored pencils well. This is actually a jump cut here where everything has actually dried quite a bit, so the other paints I went through have dried a bit. I also accidentally dropped some water on a couple spots, and I noticed that this paper is exceptionally good in certain ways and really difficult in others. It is very easy to do certain techniques and very difficult to do others. So, I'm jumping to note my observations. Backgrounds are caused fairly easily in the paint, sadly. The paint looks more pale and dull in certain ways compared to other papers. Not dull as much as strangely more pale than how vibrant it appears on other papers, especially cotton papers where it looks more amazing. The smoothness of the paper is just amazing, so it's actually really enjoyable to paint on, if not for other problems. It dries weirdly flat and smooth, and yet somehow it's actually a little streaky as well, which seems contradictory, but it's hard to explain. It washes out far too easily. It lifts extremely easily, so if I want to lift paint back off the paper, it blends and merges together. I have to be very careful when layering on this paper because underlayers will reactivate and easily come completely off the paper. These are qualities of the paper, not the paints. These are extremely good, high-quality paints, but they do behave differently on different papers. The paper can often be the biggest difference. Now, by using lifting and softening and blending techniques, you can get really smooth, interesting effects on this paper that are actually more difficult on certain papers. However, conversely, a lot of the basic techniques I'm used to using, such as standard wet and wet washes, are more difficult here. I noticed that the edges of a lot of paint easily dry harsh and get hard, sharp edges. I also noticed that the interesting thing is the Stabilo All pencil worked extremely well on this paper, which I wasn't sure how well it would work. It's incredibly smooth and very dark, rich black on this paper, and it blends and merges and uses its water solubility well. So I did a rock by using a real rock here, and I tried to use the different brushes. I was trying to use the advantages of the smoothness of the paper and liftability to help me. Using the Stabilo All pencil to help paint with the picture, I'm paleting it on the paper. I can also palette it on the palette itself and then pick it up with a brush, watering it down to get different shades of gray. It's also really good for dark black, which I lack otherwise. I'm just testing out that big flat brush to see what my options are. As I paint the bird and the fish and the building scene and everything else, I'm just working out how the paints work, how the brushes work, how the paper works, and thinking of ideas for what I can actually do for the final artwork. The paper itself works in an interesting and different way. It's not a recommended paper for watercolors, but it is a very high quality paper, and maybe you would enjoy the way watercolors work on this paper. This challenge is done in a way to teach myself different ways I can use these supplies. It's a very good way of learning what I like and don't like, and giving me options for future artworks. If I didn't challenge myself to work on this paper, I wouldn't have learned so much about this paper and how it works, or in some ways remember, because I'd used this paper in the past. Sometimes we have to use things not entirely as recommended in order to learn new techniques or to find things out about how and why we work the way we do. Off camera, I came up with the idea to paint a newly discovered dinosaur called Titalophus galorum. This recently discovered dinosaur was found in Mexico. It lived during the late Cretaceous, which is approximately 73 to 72.5 million years ago due to carbon dating of the fossils. I went through a series of processes to come to the point to get to the final painting. I did many hours of research off camera and for some reason put an awful lot of work into this, but I just decided to do all that research because I also enjoy paleontology. This close relative of the newly discovered dinosaur is a Parasaurolophus. You're seeing me use an actual Batat Museum collection figurine I've had for many years as reference to help me paint and draw. This is the process of drawing. Now, as you saw, though it went by quickly earlier, I transferred a sketch from the surface of the iPad that I fixed up in Procreate. Now what I did is I did the initial sketch, photographed it, fixed it around in Procreate, then placed the physical paper on top, turned the iPad screen on maximum brightness, and made sure to lock the screen in place. I actually used VizRef to do this so that I could lock it so everything would be locked in the exact location and size. I gently penciled it in, and now I'm correcting everything. That initial sketch wasn't perfect, it was just done quickly. You can always use digital tools to help you. By being able to move things around digitally, it was actually easier for me to trace back onto the final paper. I'm going over everything using an HB, 2H, and also erasers. I am making sure to put in a certain level of detail, but not too much, and I'm making corrections as it's needed. I don't normally record or focus on this part of it, but for some reason I put a lot of effort into this one, and I also decided to record a lot of the process so you can see what the actual stages are. I'm mostly referencing the Parasaurolophus because it's such a close relative of Titalophus, I believe is how you say it. It's the new one. It's a Lambeosauran dinosaur. It was 12 meters long. A mostly complete skull was discovered, as well as a mostly complete tail and a few other bones in the body. People aren't certain about how long the neck was or the shape of the neck, so I've seen various arguments in the reconstructions, although I decided to err on the side of what its close relative Parasaurolophus has been seen to have, based on much more complete skeletal fossils. During my many hours of research during this process, I also took note pages and looked up a lot of information about the flora that was around in the time and place that Titalophus would have lived. I looked up and found relatives, though I didn't worry about exact species. It's a little difficult to get exact species and sizes and such for paleobotany, but it's still worth putting some effort in. I double-checked a few things and decided to put lotuses in the water. However, I didn't make them blooming because I never got a pink. I didn't have any real shade of pink to use for this, so I made sure to not have them blooming. I also put in horsetails, cattails, general ferns, the idea of conifers, and cycads, as well as other plants that I knew were much more realistically alive at the time. I didn't worry as much about the exact scale of these plants because it's very reasonable to assume there were large versions of these plants, although I could have put a little more effort into getting the scale exact. I came back later and had to re-wet the paints, and I'm looking at notes. I had a general idea for a coloration, though I ended up going with a different one. I'm using the very large mop brush to go over the area. It's okay if I softly get some of the blue on the edges of the trees or the dinosaur because reflected light's a thing and I'm going to be layering on top. The smoothness and liftability of the paper meant I wasn't as concerned about getting color in the wrong place, frankly. I tried to get the edges very blurred out, and I tried to get the horizon line a little paler than the top of the sky. I just used a general mix of ultramarine and a little bit of cobalt teal blue to get the sky color, which I then watered down quite liberally. I used layers and strokes to try to get the water a certain way. I didn't mind at all going over the leaves with the blue because of how liftable and blendable everything works on this paper. I merged in the edges with a bit of raw umber. I also mixed the various colors together to get things. Here I'm using a mix that's more ultramarine blue, but it involves cobalt teal blue and raw umber to get some of these colors in here. I used different techniques, and I used this mop makeup brush here. I used the green gold mixed with different blues and browns in order to get the shades for the plants. I used different amounts and intensities of different colors. I ended up having to take out more green gold than any of the other colors, which is a little annoying because that's actually a rare and slightly more expensive and very small tube of watercolor, but I shouldn't worry about that. I'm actually trying to get stuff done, not worry about how much paint I have or how expensive things are. It was easy to make corrections and blur things out, as well as to lift very soft highlights into things. I had to be delicate about placing layers and placing shadows, but it was very fun. There's an interesting smoothness to this paper that's frankly quite enjoyable to physically paint on, smooth and buttery the way gouache feels. I often like very smooth papers for these reasons, although each paper reacts differently, and it bears in mind to look out for the strengths and weaknesses of the different papers as you're working. These mixes here are primarily the green gold, which I felt was actually the most realistic color for things like these cattails. These cattails would actually be extremely large if these Tlatolophus were full size, because Tlatolophus is quite enormous, or rather was. I did a skeletal study that you saw briefly earlier, and overall it was about 15 feet or 5 meters tall from what I could tell, and about 12 meters long, if standing on all fours or slightly reared up. This makes this animal quite large. It was more of a large herbivore. It was likely more of a herd living animal due to evidence that its relatives were, although right now it's only known from one fossil. More of a complete fossil than some things on the fossil record, it still remains to be studied in greater detail. Means word or crest. Tatoli is a word in Nahuatl language. It also has to do with Aztec for inverse comma, which has to do with the shape of its crest, I believe. This recently discovered creature has been more revealed to the world. A lot of PaleoArt has come out, and I've also been caught up in the excitement. As its close relative, Parasaurolophus, also pronounced Parasaurolophus, is one of my favorite dinosaurs of all time, I'm very interested in new discoveries. In general, PaleoArt is a very fun thing, but everyone has to remember that things are very speculative, and with new evidence, artwork itself needs to be changed to reflect the current understanding. It's very interesting to work on things. I'm trying to find a balance between accuracy and not overstressing and still enjoying making the art. I had no real pink or red. The closest thing I had was mummy bauxite, so I had to settle on using that slightly reddish orangish brown for the tongue and mouth interior. Soft washes and stippling, working wet on wet here, trying to keep things more wet so the edges don't dry harsh. I'm also trying to get things a little more dark and contrasted, which I found difficult on this paper for all the reasons already said. I'm trying to get shadows in here, and I'm missing a few colors that I wish I had. The limited 5 colors I randomly chose are a nice palette. They can work for realistic things, and they have a cohesion and a beauty to them. The problem is, when there's no real red or pink, I'm limited in what colors I can mix, and I found missing a few colors that would have been very helpful, such as a nice raw sienna or yellow ochre tone. An earthy yellow would have been more helpful. However, this limited color challenge was extremely educational for color mixing and understanding colors I have, as well as allowing myself to just focus in on various things in the challenge and not work in quite the regular way I would. I finished up with a few cobalt teal blue details around the crest and along the base of the neck, because it's likely this was more of a display feature. Most oddly shaped things on animals have to do with sexual display, and are often more brightly colored, even if that's to the detriment of avoiding predation. After things dry a bit, I go over things to darken them up, and a lot of the remaining process is just fiddling and noodling with things. Adding detail, darkening things up, harshing the shadows, and making the contrast higher, making the shadows darker, and pulling out a few highlights. Because the paper is very smooth, soft, and easy to lift, you can lift subtle highlights back into things quite easily, which is something I took a certain amount of advantage of. I wish there was the option to use white gouache, but I'm also a little happy that there wasn't, because it allowed me to use the lifting power of the paper in order to pull such things in or work without them. I like to work different ways, try different things, and work in different methods. These sort of art challenges kind of force the issue, but can be a lot of fun. This section here where you see me darkening things, adding kind of outlines and high contrast, is actually the Stabilo all pencil. I've paletted it off screen, and I'm using different amounts of water mixed in with it to create different shades of black and gray to darken certain areas. With the harshest blacks, I bring the pencil in directly on the paper, but with everything else, I'm using different amounts of water. As you can see, it takes quite a while. I end up making the picture look a little more outlined than I was initially going to, but that's because I thought it looked better that way, and I wanted to keep the edges more distinct and to keep things more clear. I actually cut out a bit of the painting process here where there's some layering and some working in of details, because it was just too much in my opinion. This entire challenge also became about learning things about Tuttle office and doing studies on late Cretaceous Mexico in general for my general paleontological understanding, as well as the art supply based challenge. I ended up combining the two. I hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.